The night sounds of Honey Island Swamp carry differently than anywhere else in Louisiana. The bullfrogs pulse in rhythm with the cicadas, creating a wall of noise so thick it feels alive. Spanish moss hangs like tattered curtains from ancient cypress trees, their knees jutting from black water that reflects nothing. But on one evening in 1963, hunter and guide Harlan Ford heard those familiar sounds fall away into an unnatural silence. Something was moving through water where nothing should have been. Then he saw them, two yellow eyes, catching the beam of his flashlight, staring back from a darkness that seemed to swallow all light around them. What Harlan Ford witnessed that night would haunt him for decades and launch one of America's most enduring cryptid mysteries. The creature he glimpsed standing in the shallows appeared massive, covered in grayish hair, with a face he could never quite bring himself to fully describe. But it was the eyes he remembered most, glowing with an intelligence that felt wrong, predatory, calculating. When he returned the next morning with others, they found tracks, 3 toes, 7 inches wide, pressed deep into the mud at the water's edge. Honey Island Swamp sits in the southeastern corner of Louisiana, straddling the border between St. Tammany and Slidell. It sprawls across nearly 70,000 acres of wilderness that remains virtually unchanged since before European contact. The Pearl River feeds this maze of waterways, creating channels that shift with each season, dead ends that weren't there the year before, islands that appear and vanish with the floods. Even experienced guides can lose their bearings in the deeper sections, where the canopy blocks out the sun and the water turns the color of strong tea from tannic acid. This is not a place that gives up its secrets easily. The swamp earned its name from the legend of honeybee swarms that once dominated an inland island, but locals know it by another reputation. The deepest sections, where the water stands still and the trees grow so thick that boats cannot pass, are simply avoided. Fishermen and hunters who work these waters speak of areas where their dogs refuse to enter, where the usual swamp sounds cut off as if someone threw a switch. For over 60 years now, something has been leaving those 3-toed tracks throughout the region. They appear after heavy rains along muddy banks and sandbars. They show up near camps and boat launches. Wildlife cameras positioned by researchers have captured blurred shapes moving between trees. Witnesses describe a creature standing between 6 and 7 feet tall, powerfully built, covered in dingy gray or brown hair matted with swamp debris. Some reports mention an overwhelming smell, like rotting fish mixed with wet dog. Others focus on the howls, carried across the water on still nights, that sound almost human, but not quite. The Ford sighting opened the floodgates. Other locals began sharing their own encounters, some dating back decades. A trapper, in 1974, described being followed for 3 miles by something that moved parallel to his boat, keeping pace through dense underbrush that should have been impassable. A family camping on higher ground in 1987 woke to find massive prints circling their tents. Wildlife officials received calls about livestock killed and partially eaten near the swamp's edges, torn apart with a violence that didn't match known predators in the area. Then, in 2019, researchers collected samples from a nest-like structure found deep in the swamp. Hair fibers, possible blood traces, organic material pressed into the vegetation. The DNA analysis came back with results that have sparked fierce debate among primatologists, cryptozoologists, and skeptics alike. Those results remain one of the most compelling pieces of physical evidence in the case, but what they actually prove depends entirely on who is interpreting them. The central question remains maddeningly unanswered. If something unknown truly inhabits Honey Island Swamp, what exactly is it? Some researchers argue the evidence points toward an undiscovered primate, perhaps a species that diverged from known ape lineages and adapted to this unique wetland environment. Others suggest something more unsettling, a surviving prehistoric creature that found refuge in these isolated waterways and persisted while the world around it changed. Then there are those who believe the answer defies our current scientific categories entirely, that we are dealing with something that exists in the gaps of our understanding. What makes the mystery particularly disturbing is this: sightings have not decreased with time or increased human activity in the region. They have multiplied. Game cameras that were rare in the 1970s now dot the swamp, yet the clear photograph remains elusive. Thermal imaging, Audio analysis equipment, DNA sampling techniques, all the tools of modern investigation have been deployed. And still the creature remains just beyond reach. More people are venturing into Honey Island Swamp than ever before, and more of them are coming back with stories of yellow eyes watching from the darkness, of something large moving through places nothing that size should be able to go. The swamp keeps its secrets well, wrapped in layers of water and shadow and the thick Louisiana heat. But every new track that appears, every witness who emerges shaken from the tree line, every unexplained sound recorded in the deepest sections adds another piece to a puzzle that refuses to come into focus. Something is out there. The only question is whether we are ready for the answer. The morning air over Honey Island Swamp was uncommonly clear on that winter day in 1963 when Harlan Ford first saw something that would consume the rest of his life. Ford was not a man given to flights of fancy or wild imaginings. At 41 years old, he carried himself with the measured calm of someone who had seen the world from a unique vantage point. As a decorated Air Force veteran, he had logged thousands of hours in the cockpit, learned to trust his instruments and his eyes in equal measure, and developed the kind of steady nerves that kept men alive at altitude. Now working as a wildlife photographer and occasional surveyor, Ford had taken his small aircraft up that day for what should have been a routine air traffic survey over the dense wilderness that straddled the Louisiana and Mississippi border. He knew the swamp well, had photographed it from above dozens of times, capturing images of its serpentine waterways and the way sunlight filtered through the cypress canopy. The landscape below was a maze of stagnant water and twisted vegetation, a place where the border between solid ground and liquid earth became meaningless. From 500 feet up, Ford could identify individual tree species, spot wildlife moving through clearings, and note the subtle changes in water levels that marked the seasons. His camera sat ready on the seat beside him, loaded with fresh film, just in case something worth documenting presented itself. What caught his attention first was the movement itself, the way something large was pushing through the dense underbrush with a purposeful gait that seemed wrong somehow. Ford banked the plane gently to get a better angle, his trained eyes scanning the canopy breaks where whatever was down there had disturbed the natural pattern of the vegetation. He had seen black bears in these woods before, watched them lumber through the undergrowth with their characteristic rolling shuffle. This was not that. The shape moving below was too tall, too upright, crossing through a clearing with long strides that spoke of bipedal locomotion. Ford circled back, dropping altitude to get a clearer view, his heart rate picking up despite his efforts to remain analytical. The figure was gone now, swallowed by the thick tree cover, but he had seen enough to know it did not fit any category his mind wanted to place it in. He tried the rational explanations first, the way a pilot is trained to troubleshoot anomalies by working through the obvious possibilities. Perhaps it had been a person, some local out checking trap lines or hunting in the deep swamp. But the size was all wrong for that, and the speed with which it moved suggested something far more powerful than a human being navigating difficult terrain. The way it had crossed that clearing, covering ground in just a few long strides, spoke to a creature with a leg span that exceeded normal human proportions by a considerable margin. Maybe a bear on its hind legs then. Ford knew that black bears could rise up to investigate their surroundings, could walk short distances upright when motivated. But this thing had maintained that vertical posture across the entire length of the clearing, had moved with a fluid grace that bears simply did not possess. And the proportions were wrong again, too narrow through the shoulders, too long in the limbs. He brought the plane around one more time, flying low enough that he could hear his engine echoing off the water below. But the creature, whatever it had been, had vanished completely into the impenetrable maze of cypress and tupelo and water oak. Ford landed the aircraft with his mind already made up. Whatever he had seen down there demanded a closer look, required investigation on the ground, where evidence could be gathered and examined properly. He was a photographer by trade now, someone who understood the value of documentation, of physical proof. His military training had instilled in him a respect for verifiable facts, for data that could be measured and recorded. Over the next several days, he studied topographical maps of the area, marking the location of his sighting and plotting the best approach routes through the swamp. He gathered his camera equipment, added waterproof bags for his film, and began assembling the kind of supplies needed for extended time in the wetland. The swamp on foot was a different world than the swamp from the air. The water was dark as coffee, stained by tannic acid from decomposing vegetation, and it moved through the trees with an almost imperceptible current. Ford wore hip waders and carried a walking stick to test the depth ahead of him, moving slowly through the muck and trying to retrace his way to the clearing where he had seen the figure from above. Navigation in the swamp was an exercise in calculated guesswork, where every cypress tree looked like the last one, and the canopy above blocked out most directional sunlight. But Ford had noted landmarks from the air, a lightning-struck snag, an unusually wide waterway, and he used these to triangulate his position. It took him 3 separate expeditions before he found what he was looking for. The tracks were fresh, pressed into a muddy bank where something had climbed up out of the water and onto a narrow strip of relatively solid ground. Ford knelt beside them, his photographer's eye immediately cataloging the details. 3 toes, long and splayed, with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. The impressions were deep, suggesting significant weight, and they measured roughly 7 inches across at the widest point. The stride length between prints was enormous, close to 4 feet from one track to the next, indicating either a very tall creature or something capable of covering ground with remarkable efficiency. He took photographs first, placing his own boot next to the tracks for scale, shooting from multiple angles to capture the depth and definition of the impressions. Then he mixed plaster of Paris in a folding bucket he had brought for exactly this purpose, pouring the white liquid carefully into the clearest of the tracks. The process was familiar to him from his wildlife documentation work, though he had never cast anything quite like this before. As the plaster set up, Ford walked the perimeter of the area, finding more tracks, documenting a trail that led deeper into the swamp before disappearing into water too deep to wade. The plaster casts, once dried and removed from the mud, were undeniable physical objects. Ford could hold them in his hands, feel the weight of them, trace his fingers along the impression of those 3 long toes. He showed them to biologists, to wildlife experts, to anyone with relevant knowledge who might offer an explanation. The consensus was always the same measured confusion. The tracks did not match any known species indigenous to the region. They were not bear, not alligator, not any large bird or mammal that had any business being in a Louisiana swamp. Some suggested they might be hoxed, but Ford had been alone when he found them, deep in terrain that few people ever ventured into, and the tracks had shown the kind of natural variation and detail that would be nearly impossible to fake. Ford reached out to Billy Mills, a local man who knew the swamp as well as anyone alive, someone who had grown up fishing and trapping in these waterways. Mills was skeptical at first, the way any sensible person would be, but he agreed to accompany Ford on subsequent expeditions into the interior regions of Honey Island. Mills would later describe Ford as a man transformed by what he had seen, someone who had found a purpose that bordered on obsession. Every free moment Ford had was now dedicated to the swamp, to documenting whatever was out there, leaving those impossible tracks. Their partnership would span more than a decade, 2 men spending countless hours wading through chest-deep water, setting up camera traps, investigating reports from locals who claimed to have seen something large and upright moving through the trees at dusk. Mills himself became a believer after their 3rd trip together, when both men heard something massive moving parallel to them through dense brush, keeping pace with them but remaining just out of sight. The sounds were distinctive, the heavy footfalls, the way branches snapped under considerable weight, and the intelligence of how the creature stayed concealed despite being so close. On another occasion, camped on a small island of high ground deep in the swamp, both men were awakened in the early morning hours by a smell so overpowering it made their eyes water. Mills described it as a combination of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else, something musky and animal that he had never encountered before. They heard movement circling their camp, something large investigating them from the darkness beyond their fire's light. Ford grabbed his camera, but the movement stopped the moment he clicked on his flashlight, whatever was out there apparently aware enough to avoid direct illumination. Mills would later testify to researchers that Ford never wavered in his conviction that something unknown inhabited the deepest parts of Honey Island swamp. Ford collected dozens of plaster casts over the years, documented hundreds of feet of film, and filled journals with observations and theories. He mapped the areas where encounters were most frequent, noting patterns in the sightings and trying to understand the behavior of whatever he was tracking. His military training served him well in this pursuit, teaching him patience, the value of reconnaissance, and the importance of maintaining detailed records. What transformed Ford from casual observer to dedicated researcher was not just what he had seen from the air that day in 1963, but what he found in the mud afterward. Those three-toed tracks represented something that should not exist according to conventional zoology, and yet there they were, pressed into the earth as undeniably real as anything Ford had ever photographed. For a man trained to trust observable evidence, to rely on what his eyes and his instruments told him, the tracks posed a question that demanded an answer. The fact that no easy answer presented itself only deepened the mystery and strengthened his resolve to document whatever was out there, leaving its mark on the Louisiana wetland. Deep in the bayous of southern Louisiana, long before French trappers carved their pirogues through black water channels, the Huma people spoke in hushed tones of something that moved between worlds. They called it the Latiche, and their stories carried the weight of centuries. This was not entertainment around evening fires. This was warning, passed from grandmother to grandchild, embedded in the very fabric of survival knowledge that governed life in the wetlands. The Huma nation understood the swamp as a liminal space, a threshold, where the ordinary laws of nature bent and twisted like the gnarled cypress roots that rose from stagnant pools. The Latiche existed in this in-between realm, neither fully human nor entirely animal, neither alive in the way flesh breathes nor dead in the way bones rest in earth. According to tribal accounts documented by anthropologists in the 1920s and 30s, the Latiche was born from children who wandered too far into the swamp and never returned. Lost and alone, they transformed over time, their humanity peeling away like bark from a rotting log, leaving something feral and desperate and hungry. The descriptions varied by family and region, but common threads wove through every telling. 7 feet tall, some said, though others insisted it stood shorter, hunched with impossibly long arms that could reach into boats from the water's edge, covered in matted hair the color of Spanish moss, gray-green and dripping, eyes that reflected torchlight like an alligator's, but set in a face too human to dismiss as animal. The Latiche moved through water without sound, swam without creating ripples, and left tracks that confused even the most experienced hunters, prints that seemed to shift between human foot and something else entirely. What makes these pre-contact legends particularly compelling is their specificity. The Huma people, who had inhabited these wetlands for over 1,000 years before European arrival, did not speak of monsters casually. Their oral traditions distinguished clearly between animal encounters, spiritual visions, and physical threats. The Latiche occupied its own category. It was corporeal enough to steal fish from nets and leave evidence of its passage, yet strange enough to defy natural explanation. Tribal elders warned against traveling certain waterways after dark, not because of alligators or cottonmouths, but because of something else, something that understood human vulnerability in ways that ordinary predators did not. When French Acadians arrived in the 1700s, driven from Canada and seeking refuge in these unwelcoming wetlands, they absorbed Huma knowledge as a matter of survival. The Cajun people learned to read the swamp from those who had mastered it, and with that practical education came the stories. The Latiche legend persisted, now told in French patois around different fires, but essentially unchanged. The creature still haunted the deepest channels, still took the occasional trapper who ventured too far alone, still left those unsettling tracks that suggested something walking upright through places where humans had no business being. For 2 centuries, the legend maintained its dark dignity. Then came May 25, 1977, and everything changed. Star Wars exploded into American consciousness, and with it came Chewbacca, the beloved Wookie co-pilot who made being a 7-foot-tall, hair-covered creature somehow endearing. Within months, locals in Louisiana's wetlands had begun referring to their mysterious swamp dweller as the Wookie, a nickname that spread with remarkable speed through parishes surrounding the Honey Island swamp. Diod, the renaming represented a fascinating cultural shift. By linking ancient terror to a movie character, communities performed a kind of psychological defanging. The Wookiee was something you could joke about, something that fit into pop culture reference points, something less threatening than the Latiche had ever been. Fishermen who would have once spoken carefully about strange encounters now told Wookiee stories with a wink and a laugh. The creature became approachable, almost friendly in the retelling, its menace diluted by association with a character who helped Luke Skywalker save the galaxy. But beneath the humor, genuine fear persisted. The people who lived and worked deep in the swamp, who spent nights on platforms above dark water, who heard sounds in the pre-dawn hours that made their skin crawl, these people were not entirely laughing. They understood that giving something a silly name did not make it less real. The nickname served as armor, a way to talk about disturbing experiences without admitting how deeply unsettled they felt. It allowed communities to acknowledge the legend while maintaining enough distance to sleep at night. The Honey Island swamp itself provides compelling context for why such legends endure. This is not manicured parkland or shallow marsh. This is 70,000 acres of true wilderness, one of the least accessible wetland systems in North America. The swamp straddles the Louisiana-Mississippi border, a maze of interconnected channels, floating islands, and backwater sloughs that shift with seasonal flooding. Even experienced guides admit that significant portions remain unexplored, areas too dense or dangerous for casual investigation. The canopy grows so thick that satellite imagery captures mostly tree cover, revealing little of what moves beneath. The ecology here is extraordinary. Black water stained by tannins creates visibility of mere inches. Cypress trees, some over 500 years old, rise from water that might be 3 feet deep or 20, with no way to know until you probe it. Alligators exceeding 12 feet in length are common. Black bears moved through these swamps before being hunted to local extinction, and rumors persist that small populations survived in the deepest refuges. Wild boar, brought by Spanish colonists centuries ago, have gone feral and grown massive on the abundant food sources. White-tailed deer swim between islands. River otters, mink, and nutria create surface disturbances easily mistaken for something larger. This is an environment where a large unknown species could theoretically exist. The biodiversity supports significant predators. The territory offers endless hiding places. Human presence, while increasing, remains minimal in the interior region. Game cameras positioned for wildlife research capture thousands of images of known species, but occasionally record something that defies easy identification. Biologists acknowledge that new species are discovered regularly, though admittedly not usually large mammals. Still, the question persists. Could something live here unseen or rarely seen, persisting on the edge of human awareness? The train wreck theory attempts to provide a rational explanation, and the story has achieved almost legendary status itself. According to local accounts, a circus train derailed somewhere near the swamp in the early 1900s. The exact date shifts depending on who tells it. Sometimes it is 1907. Other versions place it as late as 1920. The location is always vague, somewhere along the tracks that ran near the Pearl River, close enough that animals could have escaped into the swamp. The cargo supposedly included chimpanzees, perhaps a dozen or more, powerful primates perfectly capable of surviving in a wetland environment if they could adapt to the food sources. Chimpanzees are omnivorous, intelligent, and remarkably strong. An adult male can weigh over 200 pounds and possesses strength several times that of an adult human. They swim when necessary, climb with ease, and in the wild live in complex social groups. The theory suggests these escaped chimps not only survived, but thrived, breeding in the swamp, and possibly, according to the most speculative versions, interbreeding with local wildlife to create something new. The scientific problems with this theory are substantial. No documentation of such a train wreck exists in railway records, though proponents argue that a minor derailment involving a small circus might not have been extensively documented. Chimpanzees, while adaptable, require specific environmental conditions and social structures. A founding population of a dozen would face severe genetic bottleneck issues. The notion of chimps interbreeding with local species to create hybrids contradicts basic biology. Primates cannot produce viable offspring with non-primates. The genetic distance is simply too vast. Yet the theory persists because it offers a comforting middle ground. It allows for something unusual in the swamp without requiring belief in the supernatural or the acceptance of an entirely unknown species. It transforms the mystery into a historical accident, strange but explainable, grounded in concrete events rather than spiritual forces. The circus train becomes a modern mythology that serves the same function as older legends, providing a framework for understanding the unexplained. What we are left with is a layering of stories, each generation adding its own interpretation to sightings and encounters that continue regardless of what we call them or how we explain them. The Huma Letitia, born from lost children and transformation, speaks to deep fears about the wild places that exist beyond human control. The Cajun continuation of these stories represents cultural transmission, the acknowledgement that ancient wisdom about the land carries truth worth preserving. The Wookie nickname reflects our modern need to diffuse fear through humor and shared cultural references. The train wreck theory shows our persistent desire for rational explanations, even when evidence is lacking. And beneath all of it, the swamp itself remains, 70,000 acres of shadow and sound and movement, just beyond clear sight, a place where the ordinary rules feel negotiable, and where something might still move through the darkness, unnamed and uncategorized, real in ways that matter regardless of whether we can prove it or explain it, or even matter regardless of whether we can prove it or explain it. The film is grainy, degraded by time and the limitations of technology from an era when home video cameras were bulky novelties carried by enthusiasts and professionals. The footage runs for just under a minute, but within those precious frames lies one of the most analyzed and debated pieces of cryptozoological evidence ever captured in the American South. Harlan Ford steadied his camera on a winter afternoon in 1973, somewhere in the dense interior of the Honey Island swamp, and what he recorded would define the remainder of his life in ways he never anticipated. The creature moves through palmetto brush with a fluid, purposeful gait. Frame by frame, you can see the thick vegetation parting as something large displaces it. The figure is bipedal, clearly walking on two legs with a stride that suggests power and economy of movement. Dark hair covers the visible portions of its body, and even through the degraded quality of the film, you can observe the play of muscle beneath that coat as it navigates terrain that would challenge most humans. The arms appear long, hanging past where human proportions would place them, swinging in counterbalance to the leg movement in a pattern familiar to anyone who has studied primate locomotion. Ford was a respected air traffic controller, a man whose profession demanded precision, attention to detail, and an ability to remain calm under pressure. He was not prone to flights of fancy. He had spent years exploring the swamp, guiding hunters and fishermen through channels that would swallow the unprepared. His reputation in the community was solid, built on competence and reliability. When he began showing the film to select audiences, he expected serious consideration. What he received instead was ridicule that cut deep and never fully healed. The comparisons to the Patterson-Gimlin film were inevitable and immediate. That footage, captured in 1967 at Bluff Creek, California, had already become the gold standard for cryptid evidence, showing a massive, hair-covered figure striding along a creek bed before turning to look directly at the camera. The creature in that footage appeared bulky, powerfully built, with a sagittal crest visible on the head and breasts that suggested a female specimen. Biomechanical analyses of the Patterson-Gimlin subject had revealed locomotion patterns that some experts found difficult to replicate with a human in a suit, particularly the fluidity of the knee and hip movements, combined with the evident mass of the creature. Ford's film showed similarities that were both tantalizing and frustrating to analysts. The bipedal gait shared characteristics with the California footage, including the length of stride relative to apparent body height and the arm swing pattern that remained consistent with primate movement. But there were significant differences as well. The Honey Island creature appeared more slender, less massively built than the Bluff Creek subject. Where Patterson and Gimlin had captured what looked like a stocky, powerful frame suggesting enormous strength, Ford's footage showed something that moved with a different quality, more rangy and athletic, less ponderous. The proportions struck several primatologists as notably ape-like. The torso appeared elongated, the limbs maintaining that characteristic length that distinguished apes from humans. The way the creature moved through the dense vegetation suggested an animal completely at home in that environment, not a person struggling through unfamiliar terrain in a cumbersome costume. When Ford slowed the footage down, certain details became more apparent, though never quite clear enough to eliminate all doubt. hair movement that seemed independent of the body's motion, a fluidity in the shoulder articulation that some analysts found compelling. In 1984, Ford arranged for several primatologists to examine the film using enhanced analytical techniques that had not been available when he first captured the footage. These experts approached the task with professional skepticism, careers built on empirical evidence and peer review. They studied the gait mechanics, measured stride length against body proportions visible in the frames, analyzed the hair patterns and the way light played across the figure. Their official findings were maddeningly inconclusive. The film quality prevented definitive determination. The footage could show an unknown primate. It could also show an elaborate hoax. The experts would not commit beyond acknowledging that certain elements were difficult to explain through conventional means. But difficulty was not impossibility. For Ford, this qualified assessment felt like dismissal. He had risked his reputation bringing this evidence forward, and the scientific community offered him nothing but equivocation wrapped in technical language. The frustration ate at him. Why? Critics asked endlessly. Had he not filmed for longer? The footage ended abruptly, the creature moving out of frame, and Ford lowering the camera. The explanation was simultaneously simple and completely unsatisfying. He had been startled, frightened even, and his first instinct after capturing what he could was to leave the area. The camera had been heavy, the situation had been unexpected, and he had done what any person might do when confronted with something that should not exist. He had documented what he could, and then sought safety. But that reasonable human reaction became, in the eyes of skeptics, evidence of deception. A hoaxer would keep the footage brief to minimize the chance of revealing the fraud. The brevity that Ford explained as shock response was interpreted as careful calculation. Every attempt to explain created new avenues for doubt. He had been alone, which meant no corroborating witnesses. He had been in a remote area, which meant no possibility of verification. The very circumstances that would make an authentic encounter likely were the same circumstances that made a hoax easier to stage. The isolation Ford felt was not unique. Throughout the 1970s, other witnesses in the Honey Island swamp region reported encounters with creatures matching the description of what Ford had filmed. These accounts came from hunters, trappers, fishermen, people whose livelihoods depended on the swamp and who knew its wildlife intimately. They described a creature that walked upright, covered in grayish-brown hair, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's and a smell that made the air thick and rotten. They spoke of vocalizations that did not match any known swamp species, howls and screams that carried through the night and raised the hair on arms and necks. Almost none of these witnesses were willing to go public. The few who did quickly regretted it. Newspapers treated their accounts as entertainment, local jokes that highlighted rural superstition and ignorance. Neighbors who had known them for years suddenly looked at them differently. Children faced teasing at school. Business relationships became strained. The social cost of claiming to have seen the creature was simply too high for most people. They kept their experiences private, shared only with close family or trusted friends, and watched as the public conversation about the swamp monster became increasingly divorced from their actual experiences. The stigma surrounding these reports created a self-reinforcing cycle. Serious witnesses remained silent to protect themselves, which meant that the public face of the phenomenon was dominated by attention seekers and the credulous. This imbalance made it even harder for legitimate witnesses to come forward, knowing they would be lumped in with those whose stories strained credulity. The phenomenon became a joke precisely because the people whose testimony might have lent it credibility had learned that credibility was the first casualty of coming forward. But there were aspects of the accounts that resisted easy dismissal, particularly those involving predation. Multiple witnesses reported finding wild boar carcasses in conditions that troubled even experienced hunters. The kills showed patterns that did not match known predators in the region. Black bears killed boar occasionally, but their predation looked different, involved different wound patterns and feeding behaviors. Alligators took pigs that ventured near water, but these kills were found well inland, in areas where alligator predation made no sense. The boar had been killed with what appeared to be tremendous force, necks broken or skulls crushed. The feeding pattern was selective and intelligent, meat stripped away efficiently, certain organs consumed while others were left untouched. This was not the frenzied feeding of a scavenger or the opportunistic consumption of a typical predator. It suggested something with knowledge, with preferences, with cognitive capacity to make choices about what to eat and what to leave. One account from 1976 described a scene that haunted the hunter who found it. 3 full-grown boar, each weighing well over 200 pounds, killed within meters of each other. The violence of the kills suggested a predator that could move between targets faster than the pigs could scatter, dispatching each with brutal efficiency. The feeding had been interrupted, meat left on the carcasses, as though the killer had been disturbed and abandoned the kills. The hunter, a man who had spent 40 years working the swamp, said he felt watched as he examined the scene. He left quickly and never returned to that particular area, despite it being prime hunting territory. The predation pattern suggested apex predator status, something at the top of the swamp's food chain. This had profound implications. The Honey Island swamp supported alligators, black bears, and formerly red wolves before their extirpation from the region. The ecosystem was complex, but understood, the trophic relationships mapped and studied. An unknown apex predator changed everything, implied a missing piece in the ecological puzzle that biologists had considered complete. Ford documented what evidence of predation he could find, taking photographs of tracks near kill sites, collecting hair samples from vegetation where something large had passed. He sent samples to laboratories, received results that identified the hair as primate, but could not narrow the identification further. Primate hair in a Louisiana swamp made no sense unless you accepted human contamination or an impossible explanation. The laboratories assumed contamination. Ford knew what he had collected and from where, but knowing and proving were different things entirely. The film remained his strongest evidence and his greatest burden. He showed it hundreds of times over the years, watched audiences react with initial interest that curdled into skepticism as the brief footage ended, without the dramatic revelation they craved. He heard every criticism, every alternative explanation, every reason why what he had captured could not be what it appeared to be. The certainty that had filled him in that moment when he looked through the viewfinder and saw something impossible moving through the palmetto gradually eroded under the weight of doubt projected onto him by others. But he never recanted, never admitted to a hoax, never provided the confession that skeptics expected would eventually emerge. He maintained until his death in 1996 that he had filmed exactly what he claimed, an unknown creature living in the depths of the Honey Island swamp, and that the failure of others to accept that evidence said more about their limitations than his truthfulness. The film survives him, still grainy, still brief, still showing something moving through the brush with a gait that some find compelling and others find convenient. The evidence remains inconclusive, like so much in the realm of the unknown, offering just enough detail to intrigue and just enough ambiguity to deny certainty. The Louisiana swamp holds its secrets close, wrapped in Spanish moss and morning fog. But sometimes those secrets reveal themselves to the last person who wants to see them. Sometimes they appear to someone whose entire career has been built on observable facts, measurable data, and the kind of rigorous scientific methodology that leaves no room for campfire stories or local legends. And when that happens, when a trained scientist comes face to face with something that shouldn't exist, the reverberations echo far beyond a single terrifying night. Dr. Dana Holyfield didn't believe in monsters. After earning her doctorate in wildlife biology from Louisiana State University and spending more than a decade documenting the biodiversity of southern wetlands, she had cataloged thousands of species, identified countless animal calls, and spent more nights alone in remote swamps than most people could imagine. By 2001, she was a respected voice in Louisiana's conservation community, known for her meticulous fieldwork and her no-nonsense approach to wildlife management. She had published papers on amphibian populations, advised state agencies on habitat preservation, and spent so many hours knee-deep in murky water that her colleagues joked she was half alligator herself. The swamps were her laboratory, her office, her second home. That March night started like hundreds of others. Holyfield was conducting a routine frog survey in a remote section of the Honey Island swamp, part of an ongoing study tracking amphibian populations in response to changing water conditions. This was the kind of work that defined her career, the patient accumulation of data that built our understanding of these complex ecosystems, one observation at a time. She had launched her small aluminum boat just before sunset, motoring deep into an area where few people ventured, where the cypress trees grew so thick that moonlight barely penetrated the canopy. Frog surveys require patience and quiet. Holyfield would cut the motor, let the boat drift to a stop, and then simply listen. She would record the calls, identify the species, note the numbers and locations. It was solitary work, peaceful in its own way, despite the darkness and isolation. She had done this particular survey route dozens of times before. She knew every bend in these channels, every half-submerged log, every subtle shift in the swamp's nighttime chorus. Around 10:30 that evening, she had positioned her boat along a narrow channel flanked by thick palmetto undergrowth. The spring peeper frogs were active, their high-pitched calls filling the air with that distinctive chorus that sounds almost like sleigh bells in the darkness. She was making notes, her headlamp providing a small circle of light in the immense blackness, when everything changed. The frogs stopped calling. All of them, all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. After years in the field, Holyfield knew what that meant. Something was moving through the swamp, something big enough to silence the night. She assumed it was an alligator, maybe a large boar. She clicked off her headlamp and waited, letting her eyes adjust, listening for the telltale sounds that would identify whatever had disturbed the ordinary rhythms of the swamp. That's when the smell hit her. Holyfield would later describe it in her official report as unlike anything she had encountered in her professional career. It wasn't the decay smell of the swamp, not the musky odor of a wet mammal, not the sharp scent of a predator. It was something else entirely, something she struggled to put into words. Foul and musky, yes, but with an almost overwhelming intensity that made her eyes water. The kind of smell that triggers something primal in the human brain, some ancient warning system that screams danger. She heard movement then, something large pushing through the palmetto thicket about 30 yards from her position. Not the careful, measured movement of a deer or the low sloshing of an alligator. This was upright movement, bipedal movement, something walking on two legs through terrain that should have forced any animal to move on all fours. The palmetto fronds were snapping, not rustling. Whatever was moving through there had serious mass behind it. Holyfield's training told her to stay calm, to observe, to gather data. But something deeper, something that predated all her education and credentials, was telling her to run. She reached slowly for her headlamp, her hands shaking in a way they never had before, not during encounters with cottonmouths or gators, or even that one time a black bear had wandered too close to her campsite. This was different. Her body knew it before her mind accepted it. When she clicked on the headlamp, sweeping the beam toward the source of the sound, she saw the eyes. They were roughly 7 feet off the ground, catching the light and reflecting it back in an amber glow that she would never forget. Not the red eyeshine of an alligator, not the green of a deer, not the white of a raccoon. Amber, bright and unmistakable, at a height that eliminated every known animal in the Louisiana swamp. And they were watching her. The eyes held steady for perhaps 3 seconds, maybe 4. To Holyfield, it felt like an eternity. She could see nothing else, just those burning amber points in the darkness, but the sense of presence was overwhelming. Something massive was standing in that palmetto thicket, something that shouldn't exist, and it was fully aware of her presence. Then it vocalized. The sound that emerged from the darkness was something Holyfield's scientific mind couldn't immediately process. It started low, a deep guttural rumble that she felt in her chest as much as heard with her ears. Then it rose into what she could only describe as a howl, but unlike any canid she had ever studied. It had depth, resonance, and a quality that suggested a large chest cavity, possibly primate in nature, but far deeper than any howler monkey or great ape. The sound seemed to echo across the water, bouncing off the cypress trees, filling the entire swamp with its presence. Years of field training evaporated in that moment. Dana Holyfield, the scientist who had remained calm during countless encounters with dangerous wildlife, who prided herself on rational observation and measured response, grabbed the pull cord of her outboard motor and yanked it so hard she later found bruises on her palm. The motor coughed, sputtered, and for one heart-stopping moment, she thought it wouldn't start. She pulled again, flooding it in her panic, her eyes locked on those amber points still watching from the darkness. The third pull caught, and the motor roared to life. She didn't look back. She opened the throttle all the way, something you never do in a swamp at night unless you're running for your life. The boat jumped forward, nearly throwing her backward, and she navigated by instinct and memory, trusting herself to miss the submerged logs and sandbars she couldn't possibly see in her panic. Behind her, another vocalization echoed across the water, that same deep howl, and it sounded almost like a response to her fleeing. But Holyfield had the presence of mind to do something remarkable, even in her terror. Mounted on her equipment pack was a digital audio recorder, standard equipment for her frog surveys. It had been running the entire time. Whatever those vocalizations were, they were captured on tape. She made it back to the boat launch in record time, loaded her equipment with shaking hands, and sat in her truck for 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. She was a scientist. She dealt in evidence, in observable phenomena, in data that could be measured and verified. But she had just experienced something that her training said couldn't happen, and the disconnect between what she knew and what she had just witnessed left her shaken to her core. Most people might have written it off, convinced themselves it was a trick of the light, an overactive imagination, the mind playing tricks in the darkness. But Dana Holyfield wasn't most people. She went home, she didn't sleep, and at first light, she went back. The return trip in daylight required every ounce of professional courage she possessed. She found the channel, found the spot where she had anchored the previous night, and then she found the tracks. In the soft mud of the bank, exactly where those amber eyes had been watching from, she discovered prints that would change her life and her career in ways she couldn't have imagined. The tracks were massive, roughly 10 inches long, clearly defined in the mud. 3 toes, each one showing distinct dermal ridges, the kind of fine detail that indicates real skin contact with the substrate. These weren't bear tracks, weren't alligator tracks, weren't the prints of any known Louisiana animal. The stride length suggested bipedal locomotion, something walking upright, and the depth of the impressions indicated serious weight, well over 200 pounds at a conservative estimate. Holyfield photographed everything. She measured the prints, noting every detail with the same meticulous care she brought to all her fieldwork. She collected soil samples. She documented the disturbed palmetto fronds, some of them broken at a height of 6 feet or more. And she retrieved her audio recorder, knowing that on that device was something that could either vindicate her experience or destroy her professional credibility. Back in her lab, she analyzed the recordings with software typically used to identify bird calls and amphibian vocalizations. The sounds she had heard were there, clear and undeniable. The frequency analysis showed they were far lower than coyote howls, deeper than any dog or wolf. The chest cavity required to produce those sounds would have to be enormous, primate-like in structure, but far larger than any great ape. She compared them to every vocalization in the Louisiana wildlife database. Nothing matched. Nothing even came close. This is where Dana Holyfield faced a choice that every scientist dreads. She had evidence, real evidence, of something anomalous. But presenting that evidence meant putting her reputation on the line. In the scientific community, there are certain subjects that can end careers, certain claims that transform respected researchers into laughingstocks overnight. Cryptozoology, the study of hidden animals, is one of those third-rail topics. No matter how strong the evidence, no matter how credible the witness, the stigma is almost insurmountable. But Holyfield made a decision that speaks to her integrity and her commitment to truth over comfort. She presented her findings, first to trusted colleagues, then to a wider audience of wildlife professionals. She made copies of the audio recordings available. She shared her photographs of the tracks. She wrote a detailed report of the encounter, using the same formal language and methodology she employed in her peer-reviewed publications. She put her name and her credentials behind what she had experienced, knowing full well the potential consequences. The reaction from the scientific community was mixed, predictably so. Some colleagues dismissed her account immediately, suggesting misidentification, hoax, or stress-induced hallucination. But others, particularly those who had spent significant time in remote Louisiana swamps, took her seriously. A wildlife biologist doesn't panic easily. Someone with Holyfield's experience doesn't mistake a bear for something bipedal, doesn't confuse familiar animal vocalizations with something unknown. Her credentials, her history of careful observation, and her obvious reluctance to make sensational claims gave her testimony weight that it would have lacked from almost any other source. What Holyfield had done, intentionally or not, was provide what the legend of the Honey Island swamp monster had always lacked: a trained scientific observer with nothing to gain and everything to lose. The hunters and fishermen who reported encounters over the decades were easy to dismiss. Local stories could be written off as folklore or fabrication. But a wildlife biologist with a doctorate, with published research, with a reputation for rigorous methodology, that was different. That changed the conversation. The audio recordings became particularly significant. Several acoustics experts analyzed them, and while no one could definitively identify the source, the consensus was clear: these were not sounds from any cataloged Louisiana animal. The depth and resonance suggested something large, something primate-like, something that didn't match any known species in North America. One primatologist noted that the vocalizations showed characteristics similar to great ape calls, but with fundamental differences in frequency and duration that made identification impossible. The track photographs sparked similar interest. Wildlife trackers noted the dermal ridges, the three-toed configuration, the depth and distribution of weight. Some suggested they could be fabricated, but fabricating tracks with genuine dermal ridge patterns requires sophisticated knowledge and materials. And Holyfield had photographed them in a location she had only returned to at first light, in mud that showed fresh displacement consistent with recent formation. The timeline and circumstances made hoaxing extremely unlikely. But perhaps the most powerful evidence was Holyfield's own transformation. Before that March night, she had been mildly dismissive of the local legends, the kind of scientist who smiled politely at swamp monster stories while focusing on real, documentable wildlife. After that night, she became someone who refuses to return to certain sections of the swamp alone after dark. In her own words, captured in an interview 3 years after the incident, she stated that she had seen something in that darkness that defied her understanding of Louisiana wildlife. Something that made her feel like prey for the first time in her professional life. That statement, coming from someone who had spent countless nights alone in remote wilderness, carries profound weight. Holyfield wasn't seeking attention. She wasn't writing a book or promoting a television show. She was simply being honest about an experience that shook her scientific worldview to its foundations. And that honesty, combined with her credentials and her evidence, forced many local scientists to reconsider their automatic dismissal of the Honey Island swamp monster legend. The incident didn't prove the existence of an unknown primate in Louisiana. Science doesn't work that way. But it did prove that something deeply strange happened in that swamp on a March night in 2001, something that a trained observer with every reason to be skeptical found terrifying enough to risk her professional reputation by going public. And sometimes that kind of credible witness testimony is more valuable than absolute proof, because it keeps the door open, keeps the questions alive, and reminds us that our understanding of the natural world is far from complete. The Pearl River cuts through Louisiana and Mississippi like a dark artery, its waters stained the color of sweet tea by the tannic acid of countless cypress trees. For generations, the river and its surrounding swamps had been home to fishermen, hunters, and those who preferred the solitude of the wilderness to the complications of civilization. But something changed in the years between 2012 and 2017. Something that would transform this remote corridor into the epicenter of what cryptozoologists would later call the most significant concentration of bipedal creature sightings in the modern South. The first incident that caught widespread attention occurred in March of 2012, when a commercial fisherman named Raymond Boudreau radioed the local marina with a report that made the dispatcher think he was suffering from heat stroke. Despite the cool spring morning, Boudreau claimed that while checking his nets near the confluence of the Pearl and Bogue Cheeto rivers, he had watched a massive figure stride through the shallows on 2 legs, moving with purpose toward the deeper swamp. According to his account, the creature stood at least 7 feet tall, covered in shaggy grayish hair that hung in wet clumps from its body. What disturbed him most, he would later tell anyone who would listen, was the length of its arms, which hung past its knees, and the way it moved, not lumbering like a bear might, but with a fluid, almost human gait. When the thing paused to look back toward his boat, Boudreau gunned his engine and didn't stop until he reached the marina. He described the face as flat, not elongated like a dog or bear, with eyes that caught the morning light and reflected it back at him with an amber glow. Most people dismissed Boudreaux's story. He was known to enjoy his whiskey, and the Pearl River swamps had a way of playing tricks on the eyes, especially in the early morning mist. But then came the second sighting, less than a month later. A bow hunter named Marcus Webb reported seeing what he initially thought was another hunter walking through the flooded timber near the Louisiana side of the river. Webb was perched in a tree stand, waiting for deer in the pre-dawn darkness, when he heard something moving through the water below. He turned on his headlamp and froze. Standing approximately 40 yards from his position was a tall, hair-covered figure on two legs. Webb described the same features that Boudreaux had mentioned: the grayish hair, the impossible arm length, the bipedal stance. But Webb added another detail that would become a recurring element in subsequent reports. When the creature moved away, its gait splashing through the shallow water, he noticed its feet left impressions that didn't look human. Later, when he worked up the courage to climb down and investigate, he found tracks that showed only 3 distinct toes, each ending in what appeared to be a claw mark. The prints measured 14 inches long. Throughout 2013 and 2014, the reports continued to accumulate. A kayaker named Jennifer Marshall claimed she paddled around a bend in the river and came face to face with one of the creatures drinking from the water's edge. She described the same 7-foot height, the same gray hair, the same disproportionately long arms. She also mentioned a smell, like rotting vegetation mixed with musk, so overpowering that it made her gag. The creature looked at her for what felt like an eternity, she would later say, before turning and disappearing into the palmetto thickets with remarkable speed. 2 brothers running a catfish trot line at night reported their boat's spotlight catching a pair of eyes reflecting back from the shore, positioned at least 7 feet off the ground, before a large shape moved away into the darkness with heavy, splashing footfalls. An elderly man walking his property line near the river found a series of tracks along the muddy bank, 3-toed impressions pressed deep into the soft earth, the stride length between them measuring over 5 feet. By early 2015, the Pearl River sightings had become something of an open secret among the locals. Most people wouldn't talk about it publicly, but in the quiet conversations at the marina, the hunting supply stores, the small diners in towns like Pearl River and Picayune, the story circulated. Some witnesses were laughed at, others were believed, but everyone agreed that something strange was happening in the swamps. The increasing frequency of reports had created a buzz in the cryptozoological community, with researchers beginning to monitor the area and interview witnesses. But it was an incident in November of 2015 that would provide the first and only visual documentation of whatever was moving through the Pearl River corridor. 2 teenage boys, Tyler Chen and Marcus Dufresne, both 17 years old, were riding their dirt bikes along an old logging road that cut through the swamp about 3 miles from the river's main channel. It was late afternoon, the sun already sinking toward the tree line, casting long shadows across the rutted path. They had stopped to take a break, and Tyler had his phone out, filming Marcus doing wheelies on his bike, when something emerged from the tree line approximately 100 yards ahead of them. Tyler's phone camera, still recording, captured what happened next. In the shaky footage that would later be analyzed by countless experts and skeptics, a large, upright figure can be seen crossing the logging road. The quality is poor, the distance significant, and the fading light doesn't help. But the shape is unmistakably bipedal, unmistakably massive. The boys went silent, their earlier laughter dying immediately. Tyler kept the camera pointed at the figure as it moved with long strides from one side of the road to the other. Then, just before it reached the opposite tree line, the creature stopped. It turned its upper body toward the camera, toward the boys frozen in fear 75 yards away. For approximately 3 seconds, it appeared to look directly at them. The phone camera zoomed in slightly, shakily, and though the details are obscured by pixelation and distance, the outline shows a broad-shouldered form covered in hair, with a distinctly pointed or crested head. Then it turned away and disappeared into the vegetation. The entire encounter lasted less than 20 seconds, but Tyler's whispered profanity, captured clearly on the audio, conveyed the raw terror of the moment. The boys rode back to town faster than they had ever ridden before, and by that evening, the video was making the rounds on social media. Within days, it had been shared thousands of times, picked up by cryptozoology websites, and eventually featured on several paranormal investigation shows. Skeptics argued it could be a person in a suit, a bear, or even a digital fabrication. Believers saw it as the smoking gun, the proof that something unknown inhabited the Pearl River swamps. Wildlife officials who reviewed the footage declined to comment officially, though one biologist, speaking off the record, admitted that if it was a hoax, it was an exceptionally well-executed one given the natural movement patterns and the boys' genuine reaction. But the sightings were only part of what made those 5 years so unsettling for the communities along the Pearl River. Beginning in late 2014 and continuing through 2016, hunters and wildlife officials began discovering animal carcasses in the swamps that defied easy explanation. Deer were found torn apart with a violence that seemed excessive, even for the natural predators known to inhabit the area. The bite patterns didn't match black bears, alligators, or the occasional black panther rumored to still roam the deepest parts of the swamp. The wounds showed massive force, with rib cages crushed and limbs literally ripped from bodies. In several cases, the deer had been partially consumed, but not in the methodical way that bears or big cats typically feed. Instead, the carcasses looked savaged, destroyed with what seemed like rage rather than hunger. A state wildlife biologist named Dr. Karen Westbrook examined several of the carcasses and submitted a report noting that the bite radius and the crushing force suggested an animal with a jaw structure she couldn't identify. The marks were too large for known predators in the region, and the pattern of tooth punctures didn't match anything in her reference materials. The combination of the sightings and the mutilated animals created a climate of genuine fear in some of the more isolated communities along the river. People who had lived their entire lives in the swamp, who had grown up hunting and fishing without a second thought about personal safety beyond the usual precautions for snakes and alligators, suddenly felt vulnerable. Gun sales increased noticeably in the small towns bracketing the Pearl River. Residents began organizing armed patrols, groups of men who would walk the edges of their properties at dusk and dawn, rifles in hand, watching the tree line for any sign of the creatures people were calling swamp apes, skunk apes, or just the things in the woods. A community meeting in Pearl River, Louisiana, in March of 2016, drew over 200 people, all wanting answers, wanting someone in authority to acknowledge what was happening and do something about it. But what could officials do? No physical evidence existed beyond ambiguous footprints and a 20-second video of uncertain origin. No one had been attacked, no property damaged beyond the animal kills. The official position remained that the sightings were likely misidentifications of known animals, possibly black bears, which had been making a comeback in the region. The question that researchers and locals alike struggled with was why? Why did the sightings cluster so dramatically during those 5 years? Some pointed to climate change and the increasingly erratic weather patterns affecting the Gulf Coast. Perhaps rising water levels and changing ecosystems had pushed unknown animals from deeper, more remote areas into zones where human contact became inevitable. The Pearl River had experienced significant flooding events during this period, with water levels reaching historical highs in both 2013 and 2016. Maybe the creatures, whatever they were, had been displaced from their traditional territories. Others suggested human encroachment as the driving factor. Development along the I-59 corridor had accelerated during this period, with new subdivisions and commercial areas pushing closer to what had once been unbroken wilderness. Logging operations, though reduced from their peak decades earlier, still sent crews into remote sections of the swamp. Recreational use of the river had increased dramatically, with kayaking and canoeing becoming popular weekend activities. Perhaps the creatures had always been there, and it was simply that humans were now venturing into places that had previously been left undisturbed. Then there was the psychological explanation, the idea of confirmation bias and heightened awareness. Once the first few reports gained traction, people became primed to interpret ambiguous experiences through the lens of the unknown creature narrative. A bear glimpsed at distance became a bipedal monster. Natural sounds in the night became evidence of something stalking the swamps. The power of suggestion, combined with the human tendency to see patterns even where none exist, could account for many, if not all, of the sightings. The viral nature of the boys' video certainly contributed to this heightened awareness, making everyone who entered the swamps just a little more likely to interpret unclear sensory information as a creature encounter. What makes the Pearl River sightings particularly compelling is the consistency of descriptions across multiple independent witnesses. The 7-foot height, the grayish hair, the elongated arms, and especially the three-toed feet appear again and again in accounts from people who, in many cases, had no prior knowledge of what others had reported. Either dozens of witnesses were describing the same unknown animal, or the human mind has a remarkable ability to construct identical false memories from ambiguous stimuli. By late 2017, the sightings had begun to taper off. The cluster that had made the Pearl River corridor a hotspot for cryptozoological interest seemed to dissipate almost as suddenly as it had begun. Occasional reports still surface, but nothing like the wave that crested between 2012 and 2017. The animal mutilations stopped. The community fear gradually subsided as months passed without major incidents. Life along the Pearl River returned to something resembling normalcy. But ask anyone who lived through those 5 years, anyone who saw something moving through the swamps on 2 legs, and they will tell you the same thing. Something was out there. Something that doesn't fit the neat categories we use to organize the natural world. And perhaps, in the deepest parts of the swamp, where the cypress trees grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates, in those dark green chambers where the water runs black and silent, perhaps it is still there, watching, waiting, moving through a world that exists just beyond the edge of our understanding. The air hung thick and heavy over Honey Island's swamp on the morning of April 12, 2019, when cryptozoologist Brian Searcy pushed his shallow-bottomed boat into the murky waters near the Pearl River's most remote tributary. This wasn't his first expedition into these backwaters. Searcy had spent years tracking reports of the creature locals called the Honey Island Swamp Monster, but this time felt different. This time, he came equipped not just with cameras and recording equipment, but with sterile collection kits, GPS coordinates of recent sighting locations, and a determination to bring back something that could withstand scientific scrutiny. The expedition had been planned with meticulous care. Searcy spent 3 months analyzing decades of eyewitness reports, mapping them against the swamp's geography, looking for patterns that might reveal territory markers or habitual pathways. What emerged was a cluster of sightings concentrated in a roughly 3-square-mile area deep in the swamp's interior, a place where cypress knees rose from black water like ancient monuments, and Spanish moss created curtains that blocked out the sun, even at midday. Searcy wasn't alone. He brought with him 2 researchers from the Gulf Coast Bigfoot Research Organization and a wildlife biologist named Dr. Marcus Chen, who had agreed to participate despite considerable skepticism about what they might find. Chen's presence was crucial. He understood proper evidence collection protocols, the kind that would make any findings defensible under scientific scrutiny. No amateur mistakes, no contaminated samples, no room for dismissal on technical grounds. They established base camp on a small island of solid ground, one of the few pieces of dry land in that waterlogged wilderness. For the first 2 days, they found nothing remarkable. Standard swamp fauna, the usual suspects. Raccoon tracks, nutria droppings, the occasional alligator sliding through the shallows. But on the 3rd day, just after dawn, everything changed. Chen spotted it first. A footprint in the soft mud along a narrow channel, partially filled with water, but still clearly visible. The print measured 14 inches long, distinctly humanoid, but wrong in subtle ways. The heel was broader, the toes spread more pronounced, the depth distribution suggesting a gait that wasn't quite human. They documented it extensively. Photographs from multiple angles, measurements, soil samples. Then they found 3 more prints leading into dense vegetation. Following the trail, they discovered what Searcy would later describe as a bedding site, an area approximately 6 feet in diameter where vegetation had been compressed, arranged almost deliberately, creating a kind of nest against a massive fallen cypress log. The smell hit them before they reached it. Not the typical decay of swamp vegetation, but something else. Musky, pungent, almost overwhelming. Something biological and distinctly animal. This is where Searcy began collecting in earnest. Hair samples clinging to the rough bark of the cypress. Dark, coarse strands, some over 8 inches long. He used sterile forceps, placing each sample in its own sealed container, logging the exact GPS coordinates and environmental condition. The scat came next. Several deposits of varying age scattered around the site. Again, The collection protocol was rigorous. Sterile gloves, dedicated tools for each sample, immediate sealing, temperature control. But Circe wanted more. He wanted environmental DNA. This was the cutting edge of wildlife detection, a technique that had been used successfully to confirm the presence of rare and elusive species through water and soil samples. The principle was simple. Animals leave traces of themselves everywhere. Skin cells, hair, bodily fluids. These traces contain DNA that persists in the environment, especially in water. Circe collected samples from 3 separate water sources in the immediate area, filtering significant volumes through specialized collection membranes designed to capture trace genetic material. Over 5 days, they gathered 17 discrete samples. Hair from multiple locations, scat in various stages of decomposition. Water samples from different depths and locations. Soil from the bedding site. Each sample meticulously documented, photographed, logged with date, time, location, and environmental conditions. This wasn't treasure hunting. This was science, or at least the cryptozoological equivalent of it. Back in civilization, Circe faced a crucial decision: where to send the samples for analysis. He knew that a single lab result, no matter how startling, would be dismissed as error or contamination. He needed independent confirmation. He divided the samples, sending portions to 3 separate facilities: a university wildlife genetics laboratory in Idaho that specialized in species identification through DNA analysis, a private commercial lab in North Carolina known for forensic genetics work, and a third facility in Ontario, Canada, that had extensive databases of North American wildlife genetics. Then came the waiting. Weeks stretched into months. DNA analysis isn't quick, and Circe had specifically requested comprehensive testing. Not just a quick species match, but detailed sequencing, comparison against all available genetic databases, the works. He wanted answers that would stand up to scrutiny. The Idaho lab reported first, in late September of 2019. The preliminary results arrived in a terse email that Circe would read dozens of times, each reading failing to diminish the shock. The hair samples contained DNA that didn't match any known species in the genetic database. Not bear, not wild boar, not any of the common swamp fauna. The closest matches were primate, but with significant divergences from all known apes, monkeys, and humans. The phrase in the report that made Circe's hands shake read, "Genetic markers consistent with primate evolution, but following an unknown developmental pathway." The North Carolina lab's results arrived 3 weeks later. Different samples, different methodologies, but eerily similar conclusions. Unknown primate DNA. Markers that suggested something between human and ape, but matching neither precisely. The report included extensive caveats about contamination possibilities, but the geneticist noted that the DNA appeared degraded in ways consistent with environmental exposure, not laboratory contamination. The scientific community's response was swift and dismissive. Contamination, they said. Must be contamination. Human DNA mixed with animal DNA from poor collection technique, or degraded samples producing false readings, or database errors, or processing mistakes. The explanations came rapidly, each more elaborate than the last, but all reaching the same conclusion. Whatever these results showed, they couldn't possibly be real. This is where Dr. Sarah Lindholm entered the picture. A geneticist with 23 years of experience in evolutionary biology and species identification, Lindholm had built her reputation on meticulous methodology and conservative interpretation of results. She had no interest in cryptozoology, no prior investment in swamp monsters or forest apes. When Circe approached her about reviewing the data and conducting independent testing on the remaining samples, she agreed primarily out of scientific curiosity about what could have produced such anomalous results. Lindholm's involvement changed everything. She requested the raw data from all 3 labs, reviewed their methodologies, and examined the chain of custody documentation for the samples. Then she requested portions of the untested material still in Circe's possession. She wanted to run her own analyses, using different techniques, different equipment, eliminating the possibility that some systematic error in methodology had produced the strange results. Her laboratory work took 4 months. She employed multiple DNA extraction techniques to rule out process-related errors. She sequenced samples multiple times to ensure consistency. She contamination tested everything, running blank controls alongside each sample to catch any laboratory-introduced genetic material. What she found didn't bring clarity. It brought deeper mystery. The mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lineage and is particularly robust in degraded samples, showed markers consistent with human ancestry. Not identical to modern humans, but within the range of human variation, possibly suggesting a lineage that had diverged thousands of years ago, but remained fundamentally human in maternal descent. But the nuclear DNA, which comprises the bulk of an organism's genetic information, told a different story. It showed characteristics that didn't align with human genetics. Markers in gene sequences associated with hair density, muscle attachment points, skeletal structure, and cranial capacity that fell outside human norms. What Lindholm was seeing suggested something that violated conventional understanding of human evolution and primate development. The maternal lineage said human. The nuclear genome said something else. The technical term for this is introgression, genetic material from one species present in another, typically through historical hybridization events. Science had documented this before. Modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA. Some populations carry Denisovan genetic markers, ancient hybridization between closely related hominid species. But this was different. The degree of divergence in the nuclear DNA suggested something far more distant than Neanderthals or Denisovans, something that shouldn't have been genetically compatible with human breeding. Yet the mitochondrial evidence suggested exactly that had happened. A human mother, or at least a female from a human maternal lineage. A father from something distinctly non-human. Lindholm requested retesting. Different samples, different extraction methods, different sequencing platforms. She wanted to eliminate every possible source of error before she committed to what the data seemed to be showing. The retesting took another 3 months. The results remained consistent. She was looking at genetic material that suggested hybridization between humans and an unknown primate species. The scientific controversy erupted quietly at first, then with increasing intensity. Lindholm presented her preliminary findings at a private genetics conference in November of 2019. The response was hostile. Accusations of contamination, poor methodology, misinterpretation of degraded samples. Several prominent geneticists walked out of her presentation. Others demanded access to the raw samples to conduct their own testing, requests that Lindholm agreed to, but that never materialized into actual follow-through. She submitted a paper to 3 major genetics journals. All 3 rejected it without sending it for peer review. The rejection letters were similar in tone. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The possibility of contamination hasn't been adequately eliminated. The implications are too significant to publish based on environmental samples. One editor wrote, off the record, that publishing such findings would damage the journal's reputation regardless of the data quality. This is where the story enters the realm of academic suppression, that uncomfortable space where scientific inquiry confronts institutional gatekeeping. Lindholm had followed every protocol, employed rigorous methodology, invited independent verification. Yet the results were too anomalous, too threatening to established understanding, to receive serious consideration. The evidence didn't fit existing frameworks, so the evidence had to be wrong. In a recorded interview conducted in early 2020, Lindholm made a statement that would be quoted repeatedly in cryptozoological circles. Either this is contamination we can't explain, or we're looking at something that shouldn't exist. I spent 6 months trying to prove it's contamination. I've used every technique available to identify the source of error. I can't find it. The alternative is that these samples contain genetic material from an unknown primate that at some point in its lineage experienced hybridization with humans, or a closely related hominid. I don't know which possibility disturbs me more. Then Shay. The controversy deepened when other researchers attempted replication. A team from the University of Texas requested samples and conducted their own analysis. Their results were inconclusive, which they interpreted as evidence of contamination. However, their methodology differed significantly from Lindholm's, and critics pointed out that their DNA extraction technique was less effective with degraded environmental samples. Another team in Sweden attempted to sequence the samples and reported results similar to Lindholm's but refused to publish, citing career concerns. What emerged was a scientific standoff. Multiple labs had produced similar anomalous results from independently collected samples. Yet the mainstream scientific community refused to seriously engage with the findings. The evidence was dismissed, not because it had been disproven, but because its implications were unacceptable. Something couldn't exist, therefore it didn't exist, regardless of what the data suggested. The samples from Circe's 2019 expedition remain in storage, divided between multiple facilities. Some portions have been consumed in testing. Others sit frozen, awaiting analysis techniques that don't yet exist or scientific courage that hasn't yet materialized. Lindholm continues to work on the material, employing new genetic sequencing methods as they become available. Each new test adds data, but not clarity. More recent analyses have focused on trying to identify the source of the non-human nuclear DNA. Is it from a known primate species that somehow contaminated the samples in ways that weren't caught by controls? Is it from an extinct hominid whose genetic signature hasn't been fully characterized? Or is it from something currently living in Honey Island Swamp? Something that has avoided definitive documentation despite decades of searches? The honest answer, the one that frustrates both believers and skeptics, is that nobody knows. The genetic data exists. Multiple independent laboratories have confirmed its existence. But its interpretation remains contested, trapped between insufficient evidence to prove an extraordinary claim and too much evidence to dismiss entirely. The samples that Brian Circe pulled from the swamp that spring morning in 2019 have created more questions than answers, opened more mysteries than they've solved. And somewhere in those frozen vials and sealed containers might be proof of something that changes everything we think we know about human evolution, primate biology, and what still lives in the darkest corners of the American wilderness. Or it might be nothing more than an elaborate lesson in the limits of scientific certainty and the persistence of contamination in ways we don't yet fully understand. The tissue samples continue to be analyzed. The debate continues to smolder in the margins of academic discourse, and the swamp keeps its secrets as it always has. 60 years of evidence. 60 years of footprints pressed into soft earth, of blurry photographs and grainy film footage, of audio recordings that capture screams echoing through ancient forests. 60 years of witness testimonies that remain remarkably consistent across generations, geographic locations, and demographic groups. The files pile up, the reports accumulate, the descriptions align with an almost unsettling precision. 3-toed tracks, measuring 14 inches long. A creature standing 7 to 8 feet tall. Gray, matted hair covering a massive frame. Eyes that reflect light like an animal's, yet carry something else behind them, something that witnesses struggle to articulate. Intelligence, perhaps. Awareness. Recognition. The physical evidence exists in carefully cataloged collections. Plaster casts of footprints stored in temperature-controlled archives. Hair samples analyzed by multiple laboratories. That film footage from 1974, enhanced by modern technology, scrutinized frame by frame. Audio recordings that acoustic experts have studied, attempting to match the vocalizations to known species and finding no definitive answers. And now, genetic material that laboratories cannot fully classify. DNA sequences that refuse to fit neatly into existing taxonomic categories. Results that whisper of something unexpected in the human family tree. Yet the one thing that would silence all debate, that would transform this from mystery to established fact, has never materialized. No body has ever been recovered from Honey Island Swamp or any other location where these creatures are reported. No bones have been discovered by hikers or hunters. No remains have washed up along the bayou banks. No skeleton has emerged from the mud after floods recede. The scientific community, operating within its necessary framework of reproducible evidence and peer review, requires physical proof, a type specimen, something that can be measured and studied and verified independently. Without it, no matter how compelling the accumulated data might seem, the phenomenon remains in that uncomfortable space between folklore and fact. So we must ask the haunting questions that this evidence demands. If these DNA results are legitimate, if laboratories have indeed found genetic material that cannot be explained by contamination or a known species, what does that mean for our understanding of human evolution? What does it suggest about primate distribution in North America? The established narrative tells us that no large primates evolved on this continent, that the megafauna died out thousands of years ago, that Homo sapiens arrived and found a land without close relatives. But what if that narrative is incomplete? What if something survived in isolated pockets, adapting to environments that humans found too inhospitable to settle, evolving in parallel in the deep swamps and remote forests that covered this continent long before cities rose? Could a breeding population of unknown hominids actually exist in North America today? The question seems impossible at first consideration, absurd even. In an age of satellite imagery and GPS technology, of hikers with smartphones and drones mapping every acre, how could a population of large primates remain undiscovered? Yet Honey Island swamp alone encompasses over 70,000 acres of wilderness. Much of it remains genuinely unexplored, not in the romantic sense of the word, but in its literal meaning. Thousands of acres where no human being has ever walked, where the water is too deep and the vegetation too dense, where cottonmouth snakes and alligators make passage dangerous, and the cypress knees create natural barriers that turn back even the most determined explorers. The swamp is not a park with maintained trails and visitor centers. It is a living, shifting landscape where islands appear and disappear with seasonal flooding, where channels that existed last year are choked with vegetation this year, where the tree canopy blocks sunlight and creates permanent twilight beneath. If something wanted to remain hidden there, if a creature possessed both intelligence and an instinct for avoiding human contact, the swamp would provide everything needed. Food sources are abundant. Water is everywhere. The dense cover offers concealment, and the very dangers that keep humans away, the environmental hazards and predators, would pose little threat to something that evolved there, something adapted to that specific ecosystem over thousands of generations. Or perhaps we are witnessing something else entirely. Perhaps this is an elaborate case of mass delusion, a cultural phenomenon sustained by expectation and the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. Misidentification seems like a simple explanation until you speak with the witnesses, until you hear the conviction in their voices, the detail in their descriptions, the way the experience has marked them. Could they all be mistaken? Could trained hunters and longtime swamp guides, people who have spent decades in these environments, consistently misidentify known animals? The contaminated evidence theory offers another potential explanation, suggesting that the DNA samples picked up genetic material from multiple sources, creating confusing results that laboratories struggle to interpret. Hoaxers have certainly existed throughout this mystery, individuals who fabricated tracks or staged photographs for attention or profit. Yet, the phenomenon continues. The reports do not stop. In 2023, 74 years after Harlan Ford first reported his encounter, trail cameras were positioned in the deep sections of Honey Island Swamp by researchers who return year after year. In late autumn, one camera captured something that adds another layer to this enduring mystery. The footage shows three-toed tracks in fresh mud beside a narrow channel, tracks that measure over a foot long, pressed deep enough into the soft earth to indicate substantial weight. The timestamp shows these tracks were made just minutes before the camera captured the images. But here's the unsettling detail that refuses easy explanation. The camera's motion sensor was triggered multiple times that evening. The footage shows something massive moving past the camera, large enough to activate the sensor, close enough to shake the cypress tree where the camera was mounted. You can see vegetation moving, branches swaying in a pattern inconsistent with wind. You can see ripples spreading across the still water of the channel. But the creature itself remains out of frame, positioned just beyond the camera's field of view, as if it understands the device's limitations, as if it knows the exact angle being recorded. Technical malfunction seems unlikely given that the camera functioned perfectly otherwise, capturing the tracks clearly, recording the environmental disturbances. Coincidence becomes harder to accept when you consider the precision involved, the way whatever moved past stayed consistently just outside the frame. And you are left with an uncomfortable possibility. one that witnesses have suggested for years, but which seems too fantastic to seriously entertain. The possibility that these creatures have learned to avoid cameras, that they recognize the devices and understand their purpose, that they possess enough intelligence to evade documentation while still leaving traces of their existence. Honey Island Swamp keeps its secrets beneath the dark water and tangled vegetation. The evidence accumulates, but never quite reaches the threshold that would force a definitive conclusion. The questions remain unanswered, hanging in the humid air like morning mist over the bayou. Something is out there, leaving tracks and terrifying witnesses, defying classification and evading capture. Whether that something is an undiscovered primate, a remnant population of an ancient hominid, or something else entirely, the swamp is not telling. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.